Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, the NBA GM survey is out and a lot of Wolves positivity throughout the survey. GMs even picked the Wolves to finish second in the West. However, just how accurate were those guys last year in predicting the Western Conference? We'll break down the whole GM survey upcoming. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to us by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets, guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Happy Wednesday, everybody. Hopefully, is it Wednesday? Yes. Happy Wednesday. Happy hump day, everybody. Hopefully you had a fantastic week so far. The annual NBA GM survey came out on Tuesday. One of my favorite traditions is kind of combing through that. There's always a ton of mentions for many of the teams in the league, even when the Wolves were bad. It was like, remember when Karl-Anthony Towns was picked as the player that most GMs wanted to start a team with? It was like 80% or something crazy. Feels like there's always a lot of Wolves stuff in there, and this year is no different. But I want to start with the team predictions. I think it's pretty fascinating, especially when you compare and see how those GMs did last year, predicting, especially the Western Conference, but the NBA as a whole. We're going to get to all that here in just a moment. First of all, though, a big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube, as well as all of your favorite, as well as the app as well on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. You can download the Locked On app and watch us there too. All right, let's go ahead and jump into this survey. So the premise of the survey, of course, is all 30 GMs are surveyed. It's either GMs or GM proxies that are voting in this survey. They are not allowed to vote for their own teams. They could pass on a question. So there's some questions that not every GM answered, which is why some of the percentages get a little bit wonky. But it's like GMs can't vote for anybody in their own organization for these, which is pretty interesting. Or I should say that leads to some interesting results. So we'll get it, especially like the coaching one is pretty interesting. We'll get into the Finch stuff later, but I want to start with the overall team predictions. So they've got for the Eastern Conference, the prediction by the GMs is 83%, or actually for the NBA title, I should say, 83% believe that the Celtics will win the NBA title, which, you know, it's easy to just say, okay, they're the best team, they should win. It's very hard to repeat. It's unlikely that they'll repeat. But if you have to pick the best team in the league, therefore, you know, you're picking who's going to win the title. It's not quite the same question, but if it's handled that same way, I understand why 83% picked the Celtics, 13% picked the Oklahoma City Thunder, and Dallas got 3%, which is one vote. So only 3 teams received votes, which, like last year, the Celtics and Nuggets split this. They each got 33%. This year, the Celtics got 83%. That's how much better everybody seems to think they are than the rest of the league. Incidentally, in the Eastern Conference, they were asked to vote for the top 4 teams. And they gave them 4 points for first place vote, 3 for second, and so on. Last year, 53% picked Boston to win the East. This year, 97%. So everybody except for Boston's vote voted for Boston to win the West. So Cleveland got the other 3%. So whoever voted for Boston, if it's actually their GM or not, if it's actually Brad Stevens or whoever it is that's filling this out, they picked Cleveland to win the Eastern Conference because they couldn't pick themselves. Second place in the voting was the Knicks, although Philadelphia actually got more votes for the second seed. It's just the Knicks got more second and third combined. Philly had a little more fourth place votes. So the way that this shakes out is Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Cleveland, Milwaukee, Orlando, Indiana. Last year, the way that the GMs voted for the East was Boston, Milwaukee, Cleveland, Philly, the Knicks, the Heat, and Atlanta. So actually not too bad when it came to the Eastern Conference last year. Like, I'm going to read that off one more time. So last year, the actual finish in the East was Celtics, Knicks, Bucks, Cavs. They thought it would be Celtics, Bucks, Cavs, Sixers. So the Sixers, now, of course, the Sixers were on track to be there, and then the Embiid injury happened, which you can't really factor that in, but you could. The Western Conference, though, was not close last year with their prediction. First, their prediction for this year, OKC, 80% of votes were for OKC to win the Western Conference. So that is, the quick math tells me that's what? 24 teams voted for Oklahoma City to win the West. The Minnesota Timberwolves did not receive a single vote to win the Western Conference. Denver got a couple votes, 7%, Dallas 7%, Phoenix 7%. However, the Wolves got 40% of the second place votes and 40% of the third place votes. So they were the most consistently ranked second or third best team in the Western Conference, which means that the consensus lifted them to second in this overall ranking that was done by these votes. So it goes OKC, Minnesota, Denver. Denver again got 2 first place votes, and then they're second most in both second and third place. Then Dallas, then Phoenix, which is probably how I would rank the teams right now. In fact, it is. I actually think I said this last week on the show. I'd go OKC, Minnesota, Denver, Dallas, Phoenix, Memphis. You can go either way there. So then it goes Dallas, Phoenix, Memphis at 6, New Orleans at 7, Golden State at 8. Golden State actually got a vote for 4th in the East in this, or excuse me, in the West in this exercise. New Orleans got 3 votes for 4th place in the West, but neither one of those teams got top 3 votes at all. Every other team, OKC, Minnesota, Denver, Dallas, Phoenix, Memphis, got at least 1 vote for 2nd place in the West or higher. Now, let's look at what they said last year. Last year, GMs predicted Denver would win the West 70%. Not far off. They only missed it by a game. Or actually a tiebreak to OKC. The order after the Nuggets, though, last year was Phoenix 2nd, the Lakers 3rd, Golden State 4th, the Clippers 5th, Memphis 6th, then New Orleans and Sacramento tied, then Dallas, then Oklahoma City. I just read off 8 team names, and the Wolves were not one of the top 8 teams in this preseason survey last year. But check this out. Phoenix, Lakers, Golden State. Phoenix was obviously fine, but they were never in a position where anybody thought they'd be a top 3 seed in the West. They ended up with the 6th seed. Okay, so Phoenix was projected to be 2nd. They got 6th. The Lakers were projected to be 3rd by GMs last year, and they got the 8th seed in the Western Conference last year. Golden State was projected to be 4th in the West, and they finished 10th in the Western Conference last year. The Clippers, actually, that one's not far off. They projected the Clippers at 5th, and the Clippers finished, where did they actually finish? 4th. So that one was close. And then it goes Memphis. Obviously, a lot went wrong in Memphis, and they finished 13th in the Western Conference, 3rd to last. And New Orleans, Sacramento, and then Dallas, of course. Dallas ended up finishing 5th, excuse me. And they were projected to finish 7th in the West. So the GMs last year did a miserable job. Now, in fairness, the Western Conference was really compressed, right? OKC, Denver, and Minnesota were all within a win at the top of the conference. Then you had a gap of 5 wins. It was very top heavy in that regard. But then the next several teams, you go Clippers at 51 wins down through even Golden State at 46. You had 7 teams within 5 wins of each other in the Western Conference last year. So it's not like there was a ton of variance there. Like everybody was pretty compressed. But still, well, it's great that the Wolves finished 2nd in this voting. I was a little mind-boggled about them not getting a single vote for the top seed in the West. And also, it's not like these guys correctly predicted anything last year anyway. Although the East wasn't bad. Like their voting for the East wasn't bad, really. So that surprised me a little bit. There's a lot of categories in here. I think there were a total of 20 Timberwolves mentions. If you take out the team mentions, I think there might have been like 17 players or coaches mentioned elsewhere in this survey. So we're going to cruise through those a little bit. I'll give some takes on a couple non-Wolves ones and also my thoughts on the thoughts about the Wolves. So we're going to do all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is sponsored by BetterHelp. What's something that scares you? Like, really think about it. It's the month of October now. I mean, share your fears, no matter how big or small. Like, this month everything leading up to the holiday at the end of the month, Halloween, lets us have fun with what scares us. But what about the fears that don't actually involve zombies and ghosts and things that are actually kind of fun, scary movies, etc.? There's a lot that could scare you, like genuinely. Well, therapy is a great tool for facing your fears and finding ways to overcome them, because sometimes the scariest thing is not facing our fears in the first place and holding ourselves back. If you've considered starting therapy, consider giving BetterHelp a try. BetterHelp is a phenomenal idea if this is something that you've kind of been pondering, feeling a little bit scared, like genuinely, not just Halloween spooky scared. Try BetterHelp. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Overcome your fears with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LocdownNBA today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LocdownNBA. All right, let's go ahead and continue on down this survey. Votes to win the MVP. SGA got 40%, Luka 30%, Embiid, Jokic, Tatum. Under the also receiving votes, which means they each got one vote, Giannis, Jaylen Brown, and your Minnesota Timberwolves, Anthony Edwards. I had said in my bold prediction on the Locked On Fantasy Basketball show, which was almost 2 months ago now, we did this in mid-August with Josh Lloyd. My bold prediction was that Ant would finish top 2 in MVP voting this year. I wasn't quite bold enough to say he was going to win it, but I said he'd finish top 2. I was a little surprised he actually only got one of the 30 GMs that voted for him. And of course, it can't be Minnesota. So it wasn't Tim Connolly or Matt Lloyd voting for Ant. Somebody else did. If you could start, this is also surprising me. If you're starting a franchise and could sign any player, who would it be? Not a single Anthony Edwards vote. Wemby, of course, got 77%. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, and still Jokic each got 3 votes. Luka Doncic got 1 vote. I'm going to skip a couple of these categories. Player most likely to have a breakout season. It's a lot of guys that haven't been all-stars yet. For whatever reason, somebody voted for Ant, but like Jalen Williams of OKC, I think had 4 votes. A bunch of guys split some votes there. But like Ant, I feel like already had his quote-unquote breakout, unless we're talking, I guess the only reasonable answer here would be this is going from star, like superstar, to like super duper star, from a top 12 player, a franchise player, to like one of the top 3 guys in the league, and the Giannis, Durant, well, not Durant anymore as much, but Giannis, Steph, Luka, Jokic tier, right? The positional one's interesting. Who's the best at each of these positions in the NBA? Because a lot of these guys get split up. So like, who's the best point guard? Luka got 37% of the vote and won it. SGA got 30% of the vote and finished second. Wonder who's the best shooting guard? SGA finished third with 20%, and Steph finished fourth with 10%. So you had 3 people voting for him as the best shooting guard for Steph. And then you had, 7 people voting for him for the best point guard. You had 6 people voting for SGA for best shooting guard, and you also had like 9 people voting for him for the best point guard. So those guys split the vote. Luka also got votes for best shooting guard, by the way. Each of those guys got votes for both shooting guard and point guard. Luka wins the point guard one with SGA right behind him, Steph behind him. Best shooting guard in the NBA, Anthony Edwards, 33% of the votes. Devin Booker got 23% of the votes. So he finished 3 votes behind Ant. SGA got 20%, like I said, Steph 10 and Luka 7. Derek White and Jaylen Brown, of course, both of the Celtics each got votes for the best shooting guard in the NBA too. That surprised me a little bit. Best small forward, Jason Tatum. That one was easy. Best power forward, Giannis, got 77% of the votes. Best center, Jokic, got 87% of the votes. Somebody voted for Wemby, which floors me because, like, sitting here right now, he's not the best center in the NBA. Like, it's a weird thing. Let's see. Highest percentage of total votes on position questions, which is a really smart way of looking at this. Jokic got 17%. Giannis got 15% because he dominated his category so much. Luka got 12. SGA and Tatum each got 10%. Best overall moves in the offseason, OKC won with 37%. Philly's right behind with 33%. People really liked the Paul George move. The front office types did, as we'll see here. Biggest player acquisition. I want to make a cat comment here, or what player acquisition would make the biggest impact. Paul George got 60% of the vote for this. Mikal Bridges and Cat split, or I should say shared second place. Each got 13%. I like, the idea of Paul George playing with Joel Embiid is great. How many games is Paul George going to play? What's his playoff impact going to be? There's a lot of questions there. Now, Bridges and Towns also split their vote, so, put that together, 26%. The Knicks came in third in the best overall offseason question. So I thought that was interesting. Most underrated player acquisition, and Caruso won that one. Dante DiVincenzo under also receiving votes as the most underrated player acquisition, which, I buy that. I think actually that's a really good category, like a really good answer for this category. Kyle Anderson, by the way, slow-mo to the Golden State Warriors. He also was also receiving votes for this. A lot of names like Casey. So it's underrated. It's not just the best. KCP in Orlando's second, Hartenstein and Tyus Jones each got 13% for their respective new teams. Klay Thompson 10, Chris Paul 7, then DiVincenzo, slow-mo, Josh Giddey with the Bulls, Caleb Martin and Gary Trent Jr. under also receiving votes. Which team will be most improved? Memphis gets 67%. That's not surprising. The Spurs were next. I buy that. The most surprising move of the offseason, Cat to the Knicks, was 27%. I'm not going to go through every single one of the rookie and international ones. The only Timberwolves player mentioned here, I was a little surprised there was no Rob Dillingham mentioned anywhere. But the biggest steal for where they were selected in the draft, this was a 5-way tie for first place. Nobody got more than 3 votes, which makes sense because you're talking, 60 guys you're picking from. Terrence Shannon Jr. at number 27, tied with Bub Carrington to the Wizards at 14, Devin Carter to the Kings at 13, Dalton Connect to the Lakers at 17, Nikola Topic to the Thunder at 12, and then Johnny Furphy to the Pacers at 35. I liked Furphy for the Wolves, but I like Terrence Shannon more, I think, at 27. I ended up coming around on that. I think I had Furphy slightly ahead of TJ on my board initially. But anyway, so tied for first with 10% of the vote. A few others we'll skip over. And then we get into defense, which is interesting. The best defensive player in the NBA. Wemby gets 40% of the vote. Bam, Rudy, and Drew Holiday each get 10% of the vote. Okay. I'll skip down to best interior defender in the league. Wemby gets 40% of the vote. So he got 40% for both best defensive player and best interior defender. Rudy was tied for a distant second in best defensive player, but he finished second with 37% of the vote for best interior defender. Wemby beat him by 1 vote. And remember, defensive player of the year voting this year was certainly, it got a little bit closer than what we'd seen previously when Rudy's won this award, but the voters still picked Rudy Gobert to win this award. So Wemby beating him by a vote among front offices, GMs, I thought was interesting. I don't know, the 10% that voted for Anthony Davis, like Anthony Davis is a really good defender. He's not better than Wemby and Gobert, especially if you're terming it as best interior defender. Bam Adebayo got 7%. Giannis and Jaren Jackson each got votes as well. Now, most versatile defender in the NBA and best perimeter defender in the NBA both involve Jaden McDaniels. He was tied for 5th with 7% of the vote, which is 2 votes for most versatile defender in the NBA. It's a category that Giannis won, followed by OG Anunoby, Wemby, Bam Adebayo, and then you get into Holiday, Jonathan Isaac, Herb Jones, and Jaden McDaniels. Jaden got also receiving votes for best perimeter defender. Drew Holiday won that with 43%, then Alex Caruso, then Herb Jones, Lou Dort. Others receiving votes, Anunoby, McDaniels, Marcus Smart, and Derek White. I get Drew Holiday and Alex Caruso being ahead of McDaniels. I could make an argument for McDaniels being ahead of Herb Jones and Lou Dort. So anyway, he's on that list and also on the most versatile list. The one that really got me, though, best defensive team in the NBA. Not the Timberwolves, and it wasn't close. The Boston Celtics were voted as the best defensive team in the NBA by a lot. They got 57% of the vote. The Timberwolves got 23% of the vote. The Thunder got 20%. So those are the only 3 teams that got any share of the vote. Last year, the Celtics finished 3rd in defensive rating. So they weren't even 2nd in defensive rating last year. Now, I know their roster hasn't changed that much, but I know it's not exactly the same, right? The Thunder, for what it's worth, a lot was made, and rightfully so, about them being top 5 on both offense and defense last year, but they were 4th in defensive rating. I actually don't know who was 2nd. Was it Orlando? No, it wasn't Orlando. Who was 2nd? See if I can find it real quick. Okay, it wasn't as easy to find as I thought, so never mind. I'll clean the glass quick. But anyway, that really surprised me that like twice as many people, actually more than twice as many people, believe that right now the Celtics have a better defense than the Wolves. Now, the Wolves are going to use Rob Dillingham this year. They are going to have Joe Ingles instead of slow-mo. We've talked about this before on the show. the Wolves are making this calculation that if they improve their offense, by this amount, then the defense can regress by just a little bit because it was so much better than everybody else's defensive unit last year anyway. I've talked about this so many times on the show, but it was the second biggest gap between the number 1 and number 2 defenses in terms of defensive rating in the last 30 years. By the way, it was Orlando that was second in defensive rating. The Wolves finished 2.6 points per 100 possessions above Orlando and 3.1 points per possession over, or points per 100 possessions over both the Celtics and Thunder, who tied for third. That really floors me, that the Wolves only got 23% of the votes as the best defensive team in the NBA. That's I know, who cares? It's the GM survey. It doesn't really matter. Is that bulletin board material for this team? Is that bulletin board material for the Timberwolves right now? It could be, right? Like the second year letdown after the initial breakthrough season can be a real thing. So if Chris Finch needs a little bulletin board material, it's right there. Really surprised that they've got the Celtics at 57% and the Wolves at 23%. All right, a few more things, a lot of Finch stuff here at the end of the survey. We'll get to all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our title sponsors over at FanDuel. Monday Night Football this week was rough for me on FanDuel. I decided to partake in the live betting during the game. Didn't go as planned. However, you get another shot on Thursday night with Thursday Night Football upcoming. There's a ton of fun stuff over at FanDuel. Of course, you can start your season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Look at this point, we're almost a quarter of the way through the NFL season, but obviously basketball's starting too. You get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. You can start with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. Again, your first $5 bet, you'll get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed over at FanDuel. That's FanDuel.com. All right, let's talk about the end of the survey. So best head coach in the NBA, Eric Spoelstra, not surprisingly, got 69% of the vote. Last year, he got 73% of the vote. So only one less vote this year. I wish I knew who finished second and third last year in the voting, but Mark Daigneault of the Thunder got 17%. So a pretty easy second place, even though the gap is massive between Spoelstra and Daigneault. And then Steve Kerr got third place with 7. Only 2 other coaches received votes. Mike Budenholzer of the Phoenix Suns, newly of the Phoenix Suns. The Wolves got Frank Vogel fired last year. Chris Finch also receiving a vote for best head coach in the NBA, and it wasn't from Tim Conley. We know that much. So only 5 coaches received a vote of any kind, and Chris Finch got one of them. Kudos to Chris Finch. Like, it's great. I would not advocate, I would not argue for Chris Finch being the best coach in the league, but him being a top 5 coach, I absolutely buy that. I mean, like, sitting here right now, it's probably the first time in forever that Greg Popovich isn't on this particular list as the best coach in the NBA. But obviously you can't, if we're taking it going into the season, we're not saying like in his career, right? We're not saying that his career isn't as good as these guys. Like, I don't know, who else are you going to put on this list? It's also pretty interesting that Joe Mazzulla is not on this list too. Dude just won a championship with the best team in the league, didn't get a single vote. So if I were, I'm sure John Corrales at Locked On Celtics is not happy about this. I'm sure this is a big topic over there this week. Which head coach is the best manager / motivator of people? No Chris Finch mentioned here. Spoelstra, Steve Kerr. Spoelstra again with a big lead over second place. Then Mazzulla, Popovich, Doc Rivers are all tied for third. Jason Kidd 6th. Daigneault, Michael Malone, and Tom Thibodeau each get votes. Michael Malone's another one that should have gotten a vote. But again, like, this is for best coach. It's not rank your top 5 coaches. Like Michael Malone, Tom Thibodeau. I mean, if I were going to do, I don't want to go too far into this right now, but if I were going to say top 5 coaches, like, yeah, give me Spoelstra, give me Daigneault, give me Malone, give me probably Kerr. And then, for your 5th one, you could argue Budenholzer, Finch, Tibbs. I don't know that I would, Mazzulla, shame on me. I forgot about him right after mentioning how they forgot about him. Like, it's tough, right? But Chris Finch is certainly a top 10 coach in the league, possibly a top 5, but good for him to get a vote here. Coaches that make the best in-game adjustments, Ty Lue with the Clippers. That's another one. It's surprising he didn't get a single vote. He wins this one, 28% of the vote here for best in-game adjustments, and I agree with that. He's well known for it. Spoelstra finished second, Dagno third, and then a three-way tie for fourth with Rick Carlisle, Taylor Jenkins of the Grizzlies, and Nick Nurse of the Sixers. Nurse is another one that a couple years ago I'm sure was very high on this list. And he's, of course, since been fired and had some rough years. Also receiving votes, Chris Finch, Will Hardy of the Jazz, and Michael Malone of the Nuggets. I would not have put Finch under best in-game adjustments. I think he's fantastic at motivating people. I think he's fantastic at game planning for the most part. Obviously, they ran into some problems in the conference finals last year. I talked about this. We've got an episode of the top of the Western Conference. The five of us projected to be the top five teams in the West, did a round table last week. And that'll air at some point here this week, I believe. And I talked a little bit about how I think Finch is fantastic when it comes to game planning, for motivating players, etc. But I think the in-game adjustments is the one area that he has struggled on. And game to game in the playoffs, as the playoffs wore on, became a struggle as well. Obviously, he had some challenges, at least mobility-wise, last year in the playoffs. But interesting that he got a vote there as well. Which head coach runs the best offense? Rick Carlisle, 47% of the vote. Missoula, 17%. Chris Finch finishes third with 13%. Another one, like, there's a lot of really creative offensive sets, a lot of the different, horn sets and things like that Finch does. And I'm very curious to see what they start doing movement shooting wise with DiVincenzo. We'll talk more about that when we do his preview. But Chris Finch had 3 for which coach runs the best offense, despite the Wolves finishing 16th in offensive rating last year. And then which head coach has the best defensive schemes? Spoelstra wins that one with 23%. Nobody voted for Spoelstra. He had another receiving votes for offense. Finch and Tibbs tied for second with 20%. So Chris Finch finished top 3 in best offense and best defense as a coach. Pretty fascinating, because like during the playoff run last year, I was pretty vocal about, like, nobody's talking about Chris Finch. And I know he had messed up. He had the patellar tendon surgery and the whole thing. But like Chris Finch, like why has he not gotten more conversation nationally? And here we see him getting his due, getting a vote for best coach in the league, and getting multiple votes and finishing in the top 3. The only coach, by the way, to finish in top 3 in both categories. Carlisle and Missoula with him on offense, Spoelstra and Tibbs with him on defense. Which newer relocated coach will make the biggest difference? Budenholzer wins that one easily, no surprise. Atkinson and Bickerstaff tie for second. Best assistant coach in the NBA, tied for first place, Sam Cassell of the Boston Celtics and Micah Nori of the Minnesota Timberwolves, which really, really surprises me. I know his profile was raised considerably because of the playoffs, because of his appearances in the playoffs last year. Media appearances, post-game press conferences, but his presence on the sideline, everybody knows who he is now. And he did, of course, interview for at least 2 jobs this offseason, head coaching jobs. So good for him. I mean, Chris Finch was on this list a lot previously. So we'll see if he's able to parlay that into additional interviews next offseason. Sean Sweeney of the Mavs, who's a lot of people think is a rising star, third on this list. Chris Quinn and Jeff Van Gundy tied for 4th on this list. I wasn't expecting a Van Gundy reference in this survey. Which active player will make the best head coach one day? Mike Conley finishes 3rd here behind Chris Paul. Chris Paul at 30%, Garrett Temple 20%, Mike Conley. Garrett Temple surprises me. Mike Conley, 13%, 3rd. And then TJ McConnell, Fred VanVleet tie for 4th here. Which team most fun to watch? No Wolves there. No Wolves under best home court. Denver got 47%. OKC got 17% for what it's worth. No mention under most efficient offense. Which team's level of success this season is hardest to predict? The Lakers win that one with 17%. A lot of teams mentioned here, like what? 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. There were 17 teams listed here. The Wolves were one of them, also receiving votes. Which player is most athletic? Anthony Edwards wins that one easily with 45%. Giannis second with 17%. Best pure shooter, fastest with the ball. None of these have Minnesota, so I'm going to skip over them. But all in all, like 18 different Minnesota mentions here. Really fun. The last thing, which rule most needs to change? Roster construction is number 1 with 20%. Apron rules / trade math too restrictive or should be indexed to team's market, which is fascinating. We'll see what that looks like with the new CBA eventually. And then second on this list is fewer games and or back-to-back, so scheduled, 17%. So pretty interesting stuff there as well. All right, that's all we have for you today. Go check the survey out at NBA.com. I guess I didn't say that at the top, that's where it is, but I think Everybody knows that. So lots of Wolves related stuff. Overall, I can't really argue too much with it. Love the Rudy respect. Love the Finch respect. A little bit head scratching at times. And the Wolves, of course, picked to finish second in the West for whatever that's worth by these GMs. So tomorrow, we're going to continue the player preview series. We did training camp roster invitees. So the two guys that fall under that category, Skylar Mays and Eugene Omoruyi, we did yesterday. And then and we also did two-way players on Tuesday's show. Thursday's show, we'll kind of work our way up the roster. I think we'll do basically like projected end of roster guys next. We'll kind of move through the rotation. And as we get to the starters, and really probably like the top 7 or 8, we'll do at least a half show on everybody instead of just a segment. Some of the players will probably get a full show, just previewing and kind of forecasting their season, what to expect, what the Wolves need out of each of these guys individually for the season. So that's what's on tap here. Of course, the Wolves play Friday night as well, so we'll talk about that on Friday's show. That's all we got for you today here on the show. A big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on Roku and Amazon Fire TV, and you could follow on X at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CK. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.